Okay, have you ever noticed like how people just love to talk?
Yeah.
Especially when they're like trying to explain a problem?
Mm-hmm.
It's like the words just kind of tumble out, right?
Yeah.
But what if I told you that all that talking could actually be getting in the way of like finding a solution?
That's a really fascinating paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
We assume that talking helps us process and understand, but sometimes it can keep us stuck on the surface.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking today. I've been diving deep into this training manual for advanced conversational hypnosis by Virginie Imir.
Okay.
And she has this like really intriguing take on how to handle those super talkative clients.
Oh, Imir's work is brilliant. She really challenges the traditional view of just letting the client talk and talk in hypnosis.
Mm.
She argues that it can actually lead them further away from the very thing we're trying to access, the unconscious mind.
So for those of us who like aren't hypnotherapists, can you kind of explain what exactly the unconscious mind is and why it's so important?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think of it like an iceberg, right? The conscious mind, that's the tip we see above the water, the part that's thinking and analyzing. But the unconscious mind is that vast hidden part below the surface. It's where our deep-seated beliefs, emotions, and habits reside. And according to Imir, it's where the real keys to change often lie.
Okay, that makes sense. So if all that talking is keeping us stuck at the surface level, how do we get to those deeper unconscious insights?
Well, Imir suggests a technique that at first glance might seem a bit counterintuitive:
Okay.
strategic interruption.
Huh.
Instead of passively listening, the therapist actively listens for those fleeting moments of unconscious communication that slip out amidst all the chatter.
Wait, interrupt. Doesn't that seem a bit rude, especially in a therapy setting?
It's not about being rude, but rather about being a skilled guide. These interruptions are done gently and respectfully. Imagine you're sifting through a riverbed searching for gold. Most of what you find is just rocks and sediment. But every now and then you get a glimmer of something precious. That's what the therapist is doing with a talkative client, listening for those golden nuggets of unconscious truth.
So instead of letting the client like ramble on, the therapist politely steps in and highlights those unconscious nuggets.
Exactly. And by bringing them to the client's attention, they can shift the focus from conscious explanations to unconscious revelations.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works, but can you give me a concrete example?
Sure, Imir uses a smoking cessation scenario. Imagine a client who says, "I really want to quit, but," and then launches into a long-winded explanation about why they can't. A skilled therapist wouldn't get bogged down in those details.
Okay.
Instead, they'd zero in on a phrase like, "Deep down, I really love it," and use that as a springboard for deeper exploration.
So it's about catching those like seemingly offhand remarks that might actually reveal a lot about what's going on beneath the surface.
Precisely. It's like a detective listening for a clue that cracks the case open.
I love that analogy. So how does interrupting actually help access the unconscious mind? Isn't it already kind of doing its own thing?
Well, think about it this way. When we're constantly talking, our conscious mind is in control. It's filtering and censoring everything. But when we're gently interrupted, it creates a momentary break in that flow of conscious thought. And in that gap, the unconscious mind can sometimes slip through.
It's like those moments when you're about to fall asleep and you suddenly have a flash of insight or a creative idea. You're not quite fully conscious, but you're not fully asleep either.
That's a great way to put it. It's like we're creating these mini trances, these little windows into the unconscious.
Wow, okay. So strategic interruption helps train the client to communicate more concisely by focusing on the unconscious rather than conscious explanations. And it also creates mini trances that deepen the hypnotic process. That's a pretty powerful 1-2 punch.
And the beauty of it is that Imir says these interruptions can actually be quite beneficial for the client, even beyond the immediate hypnotic context.
Oh, how
Well, think about it. In our everyday lives, how often do we get caught up in over-explaining and justifying ourselves? By learning to recognize and communicate from a deeper, more unconscious place, we can become more authentic and direct in all our interactions.
So this technique isn't just for hypnotherapists, it's something we can all benefit from.
Absolutely. It's like Imir is giving us a masterclass in the art of mindful communication, both with ourselves and with others.
I'm so intrigued by this whole idea of discerning between relevant and irrelevant chatter. It sounds like that's where the real mastery lies, right?
Exactly. Not all unconscious communication is created equal. Inger talks about this advanced skill of recognizing which nuggets are truly significant and which are just noise.
I can imagine that takes a lot of practice and intuition.
It does, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It's like we're training our minds to become more attuned to those subtle signals, those whispers of wisdom from our unconscious.
Okay, so We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the power of the unconscious mind, the surprising role of strategic interruption in accessing it, and the importance of discerning between relevant and irrelevant unconscious communication. But I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
You're exactly right. We've just scratched the surface.
Mm.
Now let's dive even deeper into the nuances of this technique. What's really fascinating to me is how Imir emphasizes that this technique isn't about manipulating the client or forcing them to reveal things they're not ready to share. It's
Yeah.
about creating a space of trust and safety where they can feel comfortable exploring their own inner landscape.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's not about digging for secrets or trying to psychoanalyze someone.
Right.
It's about empowering them to discover their own truths.
Exactly. And that sense of agency is crucial because ultimately it's the client who holds the key to their own transformation.
So help me understand this a little better. It seems like Imir is suggesting that the therapist needs to almost become a translator of sorts, deciphering the unconscious language for the client, right?
That's a great way to put it. The unconscious mind doesn't communicate in neat logical sentences. It speaks in symbols, metaphors, images, and even body language.
Oh, that reminds me of something I read about how dreams often use symbolism to communicate deeper meanings. Is it similar to that?
Very much so.
Yeah.
It's like the unconscious mind is speaking in a poetic code, and the therapist needs to be able to decode it. And sometimes the most seemingly insignificant details can be incredibly revealing.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure.
Mm.
Let's say a client is talking about their relationship with their boss, and they casually mention feeling like they're always walking on eggshells.
Okay.
A traditional therapist might just nod and let that comment pass. But a therapist skilled in Imir's techniques would pick up on that phrase and explore it further. What does walking on eggshells really feel like?
Mm.
What does it symbolize for the client and their relationship with their boss?
That's a really great example. I'm starting to see how paying attention to these seemingly random remarks can lead to some pretty profound insights.
Exactly. And it's not just about what the client says, but also how they say it. Tone of voice, facial expressions, body language. These can all provide valuable clues about what's happening at the unconscious level.
So it's about becoming a master of both verbal and nonverbal communication.
That's the key. And it's not just for therapists. You think about all the misunderstandings we have in our daily lives, many of them stem from not paying attention to these subtle cues.
That's so true. I know I've been guilty of misinterpreting someone's tone of voice in an email or a text message. It's like we lose so much of the nuance of communication when we're not face to face.
Exactly. And that's why Imir's work is so relevant even beyond the field of hypnosis. She's giving us tools to become more effective communicators in all areas of our lives.
I love that. Okay, so let's say we've identified an unconscious nugget. We've picked up on a phrase, a gesture, a tone of voice that seems significant. What do we do next? How do we actually use that to guide the conversation in a more productive direction?
Well, one technique that Imir suggests is what she calls framing. It's about taking that unconscious nugget and putting a frame around it, making it the focal point of the conversation.
So instead of just letting it slip by, we actually highlight it and make it the center of attention.
Precisely. And you can do that by simply repeating the phrase, by asking a curious question about it, or even by mirroring the client's body language.
Oh, the mirroring thing is interesting. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Let's say the client crosses their arms when they mention feeling stuck in their job. The therapist might subtly cross their own arms for a moment, creating a sense of shared understanding.
It's almost like you're saying, I see you, I hear you, I get what you're feeling.
Exactly. And that sense of being seen and heard can be incredibly powerful for the client. It can help them feel safer and more willing to open up further.
Now I'm thinking about Imir's point about distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant chatter. How do we know which unconscious nuggets to pay attention to and which ones to let go of?
That's where the real artistry comes in. It's about developing a deep understanding of the client's unique story, their patterns, their challenges. And it's about paying attention to what resonates.
What do you mean by what resonates?
Well, some unconscious nuggets will just feel more significant than others. They might evoke a stronger emotional response from the client. They might connect to a recurring theme in their life, or they might even trigger a physical sensation.
So it's almost like a gut feeling, but one that's informed by careful observation and experience.
Exactly. It's like we're training ourselves to become more sensitive to the subtle language of the unconscious.
You know, I'm wondering if this whole concept of strategic interruption could apply beyond the context of therapy. Could it be helpful in everyday conversations as well?
Absolutely. It's about learning to listen more deeply, to pay attention to those subtle cues that we often miss, and to guide the conversation in a way that's both insightful and respectful.
So let's say I'm having a conversation with a friend who's going through a tough time, and they keep circling around the same negative thoughts. Could I use this technique to help them break out of that cycle?
You could definitely try it. Instead of just offering advice or trying to fix the situation, you could listen for those unconscious nuggets that might reveal a deeper truth about what they're really struggling with.
So instead of saying something like, you shouldn't feel that way, I could ask a question like, what's the feeling underneath that thought?
That's a great example. By gently interrupting the flow of negative thoughts and redirecting the focus, you might be able to help your friend access a new level of understanding and perhaps even create a shift in their perspective.
So it's almost like we're helping them tap into their own inner wisdom, their own unconscious resources.
Precisely. And sometimes that's all it takes to create a breakthrough. So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into Imir's work, what are some key takeaways that our listeners can apply to their own lives, even if they're not hypnotherapists?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is the power of truly mindful listening. How often do we go through conversations just waiting for our turn to speak? We're so focused on formulating our own response that we miss those subtle cues,
Right.
those unconscious nuggets that might reveal what's truly going on beneath the surface.
That's so true. It's like we're so busy thinking about what we're going to say next that we're not really present in the moment.
Exactly. And that's where Imir's work challenges us to shift our focus. Instead of listening to respond, we can practice listening to understand, to really hear what the other person is saying, both consciously and unconsciously.
And in doing so, we might not only gain a deeper understanding of the other person, but also of ourselves.
Absolutely. It's like we're expanding our own awareness by tuning in to the subtle language of the unconscious. And that can have a profound impact on our relationships, our communication, and even our own personal growth.
So the next time we find ourselves in a conversation, whether it's with a friend, a family member, or a colleague, we can try to approach it with this sense of curiosity and openness, listening not just with our ears, but with our hearts and minds.
And remember, it's not just about listening, but also about responding in a way that honors the other person's unconscious communication.
Hmm.
Instead of offering unsolicited advice or trying to fix their problems, we can ask open-ended questions, reflect back what we're hearing, and create a space where they feel safe to explore their own inner world.
And who knows? Maybe in doing so, we might even discover some hidden truths about ourselves along the way. So as we navigate the complexities of human communication, let's keep Imir's wisdom in mind. Listen deeply, interrupt mindfully, and always approach each conversation with a sense of curiosity and respect.